I would like to start by introducing Tanveer. She is a visiting tutor at the RCA and is currently doing her PhD, which looks at how European hierarchical and racist ideas are used as part of the fashion design process. She was also my tutor in a module in the previous term, at the heart of which lay ideas of decolonization. I want to begin by asking about research, especially because it is perhaps the most important driver of innovation across all mediums of expression and fields. So, my question to you would be, how can we begin to decolonize the ways in which research is conducted in the context of design education?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question that you're asking, and it goes really to the root of so many of these conversations about decolonising education. I think we can also frame it in different ways as well, and think really carefully about who's asking the question, and where these conversations are taking place, and who's in the conversation and who's being left out of the conversation. I mention those because it's really important to think about decolonising as a process, and not just as a subject matter or something about content, because then we start thinking about the institution itself and how that's implicated. So, for example, at the Royal College of Art, it dates back to the 1850s, and really understanding where these institutions have emerged and why they operate in the way they do.
I had a question also about, when did these conversations of decolonizing actually begin? Because I have studied in a design institute in India, and I felt that like a lot of the education is maybe more Western focused. So and it was like coming to the RCA, it was a major eye opener to read about decolonization and to read about works of Ahmad Ansari. So I was wondering where that began too.
Yeah, and also, it's interesting to think in my own head where I was first introduced to a lot of these ideas. So I think, theories around decolonising theories have gone on for, many, many decades. If we think back to the beginning of the 20th century, many writers were writing about decolonising then. But the recent interest in it has been very much around from what I see, from lots of student protests. So for me personally, I first started to hear about it from Cape Town University, and hearing how students were mobilising and campaigning against the Rhodes Must Fall statue campaign. So it's been going on for a long while, but lots of these statues on the campus, which many students felt were really problematic, such as the statue of Cecil Rhodes. So what they did, which I thought was interesting, was that they made a link between that symbol and also about having free education. So they started to campaign around abolishing fees. And so those two things coming together were really important. And then you started to see lots of people were starting to make links between decolonising theories and about the actual state of education. But it's certainly been talked about for a long time, through different prisms, often through anti-racist education in the UK in the 80s, around multicultural education. But there was a much more a kind of drive with the student protests, which I think go to the heart of what these institutions are, which take it in a slightly different narrative, I think, for me, that's interesting.
It's like, I think like the last two questions are making me connect the idea of education institute and the person who's doing it. So I think I was wondering, like we're talking about student protests. So when we talk about decolonizing research, who are the other agents too, apart from students and teachers, who you think could participate in the process and even facilitate it even more?
Yeah, no, that's again, these are really important questions, and it makes us start to think about the whole way education is set up. It's very individual, it's very competitive. You're trying to get the highest grades you can get. You're expected to compete against, particularly in design practice. The expectation is that you will compete against your fellow student. So all of these are considered very neoliberal structures, and this kind of this drive for competition, success, all of these things go against the decolonising process, which is much more about thinking about collectives, about communities. So what starts happening when we start to get students to collaborate, to work maybe with other communities outside of the institution? All of these things are really important, but a big problem is the assessment criteria and how we're going to assess students when they start doing group work, when they start working outside of the institution or even critiquing the institution. So there are big question marks again about how you, and there's lots of people talking about this. Can we ever really decolonise, you know, schools and universities when they're built on the structures that are the complete opposite of what a decolonising process would encompass?
Even like in our like usual discussions, and like taking from what you said, I feel it's important to maybe decolonize and diversify the system. Like that's what, and diversify the people who are doing it, and maybe like diversify our mind, because the people who come in the institution are actually setting those structures. And they are the ones, like if they are if they have maybe decolonized minds, if that, if we use it as a phrase, then possibly we can maybe head towards decolonizing design education.
Yeah, I mean, I think because institutions are built on business models, and
Yeah.
so they're built on extracting as much profit as possible. And while we've got that model, we're going to still be attracting, we have, you know, in most institutions, they have the management and who will be focused on how the institution operates, then the academic staff, and all of these structures mean that we end up with a system which is very individualistic. You know, the fact that we have such extreme in the UK, I believe we have some of the highest fees globally, and it's, you know, and that's happened in a very short time. So when I was a student, I didn't have to pay fees, and that's only 20 years ago. So in a matter of 20 years, it's changed. It's not just a bit of fee. For a UK home student, an undergraduate will come out with in excess of, you know, or around £30,000 of just their fees alone of debt. And so there's big conversations about, you know, what happens if we get rid of that, if we start having free education. So then if you don't have a business model which is about getting profit, you might start to have a slightly different institution. And certainly people I know who talk, they don't romanticize about pre-fees, but there is a difference there, and there could be a real drive for more community-led teaching and bringing in knowledges that aren't just about knowledges in books and in libraries, but knowledges from people in the community. So particularly in a design sense, we all know that many people in our communities have got amazing design knowledge, but it hasn't necessarily been written about. And particularly from a design historian perspective, you might want to read those. You know that there will be people that want to read those histories, and we need to get those histories, those narratives out there. How do we do that? How do we connect with those communities? I think should be really at the core of any kind of design history and design practice, you know, kind of curricula.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I was trying to think of, like, are there any specific communities who have managed to do this successfully? Because I think somewhere, like I've read about, I don't recall the name, but I've read about small initiatives where they are really doing some cutting edge work. And I think it's like maybe bridging those managerial structures with the community led that might help to get a more balanced perspective.
Yeah, well, I think it's also as well that there is appropriation of ideas around community happening as well that can be quite worrying too. So I do know, you know, there are quite a few design degrees where students are expected to collaborate with, is so-called collaborate with local communities. However, in reality, when you look at the detail and when you speak to students who might be on those courses, it's still built on the model of the designer as the person who's got the knowledge, and they kind of drop down into these communities and they work from a very top down way with these communities. What we're looking for is reverse model, really, to
Yeah,
really
bottom
show
up.
that, yeah, to show that local communities have got knowledge and what can they bring into the classroom and bring that knowledge into being. So definitely a problem that kind of that is a difficulty with education is that the extreme kind of cost of fees, and there's a lot of tension if you're coming out with so much debt. You just want to kind of get on and get your qualification. That's what it seems to me sometimes, and that's a very natural response.
Yes, yes. I totally agree. And I sometimes feel the same too, actually. I think that's
Yeah,
I think this note is a good note to end on. Uh, and like maybe we should try and bridge the approaches and try and bring more community based approaches and make them more accessible. I think as a
yeah,
public facing design historian, accessibility is something which we deal with a lot. So I think that's something which I think that's maybe a good note to end on.
lovely.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for asking me again, and good luck with all the work.
Thank you so much, Tanveer. In conclusion, I would like to say that as a student, some key ideas I picked up from the conversation are that at the heart of decolonizing design education lies decolonizing and diversifying the institution, making education more accessible, integrating more community based and local approaches within education, and perhaps most importantly, thinking from a bottom up rather than a top down approach.